Well, I mean, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and there is.
Repeat the question.
Well, he was just making the comparison of some kind of a germ as attacking the body, that it is sort of a war between the germs that are invading or damaging cells or releasing toxins into the blood, or however their biology works, and the body, particularly white cells, attempting to destroy them. That the body does have an immune system that can or does attack anything that the body identifies as being foreign. And so the whole idea of vaccination is that you can stimulate an immune response on the part of the body to whatever infectious agent it is that you're trying to protect against. And if the body can react quickly enough, it can defeat this foreign invader. The problem is that often the body's immune response is too slow, and the virus or bacteria will actually kill you before it just overwhelms your defenses, so to speak. So the idea of a vaccination is, if you can subject someone to a small dose of it, then you produce the antibodies, and the body now knows, sort of for future reference, that such an organism is foreign, and so if you are exposed to it in the future, your body can quickly respond and defeat it without any disastrous effects.
How does it work in the case of one of these children who was bit by a dog who had rabies, and you'd say, okay, well, this is full-fledged rabies.
Yes. Well, it didn't go into, see, it takes about 2 months for it to take effect. It goes through the bloodstream and eventually to the spine and to the brain. So if you get a person within a month after they've been bitten, you can vaccinate them and they won't get the disease.
Well, this is a fascinating.
They won't die of the disease.
Yeah, this is a fascinating one, because Pasteur found that this approach of using some kind of a weakened or attenuating, virus, that in every case, every disease, the treatment was different. So that you had to learn the full life cycle to be able to figure out where to attack it. In the case of anthrax or chicken cholera, you could simply weaken the bacteria by heating it or something like that, or in some cases actually killing it, but the pieces, when injected, sort of the dead bacteria, would still trigger this immune response from the body. Okay? In the case of rabies, what he found was that flask that you saw was actually the spinal cord of a rabbit that had been deliberately infected with rabies. So what he would do is he would hang the spinal cord in this desiccating flask and dry it out for 14 days, so that it was virtually all the viruses were dead. So that he would inject that into Joseph Meister in his abdomen. And then the next day, he would inject virus from a spinal cord that had only been dried for 13 days, or 12 days, 10 days, 9 days, so that over a short period of time, maybe 2 weeks, 10 days to 2 weeks, he's making a series of increasingly strong doses of rabies that would be sufficient to trigger the body's immune response before the full-fledged rabies, which had entered the body from a bite, had actually gone through this whole progression to the brain. If you were only infected by the full dose rabies, that the body would not have the immune response within that short enough period of time to prevent the destruction of the central nervous system and death. So it's a very different approach than he used in other cases, and this was particularly, as Denise mentioned, you could not see the rabies virus. You couldn't take it out and study it. One of the problems that he found was you could not grow rabies in a petri dish. You couldn't grow it on some medium. The only place that it lived and lived out its life cycle was in animals, live animals. So that he had to use a lot of dogs and other animals in the experiment to try to understand what it was he was dealing with and what was the particular approach that would work in that case, which would be completely different than anthrax or some of the other things that he had dealt with previously.
I should mention that also he was attacked by the animal rights leagues in France, but particularly in Britain. They went nuts when he was using animals in his experiments. Of course, what is he going to use, right? He would have never accomplished what he did, but he was attacked.
I'm wondering if any of the techniques that he came up with, the different viruses, could they be applied to retrovirus?
Well, I mean, certainly all of these.
Because I'm speaking specifically because of AIDS.
Yeah, well, I mean, all of this was extremely valuable. And many of his students went on to win Nobel Prizes for work on diphtheria, tuberculosis, and other things. So whether the specifics of the technique would work in a specific case of AIDS, I can't answer, but this whole approach to understanding these life processes and what is unique about them has been critical to modern science ever since then. One of the things that we brought up, at least briefly, in the paper that we wrote, was what happened after he died, and beyond the specific question of eugenics was just what we've described as reductionism in science. That Pasteur was looking for what's unique about the process of a whole, in the same way that he would look at this question of chirality, or left and right-handedness, the effect on polarized light that we had discussed in the first class, where he's trying to understand this life process as a whole. Whereas what became the dominant approach in science in the 20th century was attempting to view everything from the standpoint of dead, inanimate, mechanical processes. Right? That we have to explain complex systems based on dead systems, simple systems. And because of that, you had things like molecular biology, which said, well, we can't really explain these cells and organisms. This is really complicated. So what we're going to do is we can understand how molecules interact, and we can figure out what are the molecules that make up a cell. So we'll try to explain cellular function based on the interaction of these molecules, and somehow try to explain a living organism as these sacks of molecules that somehow are bumping into each other according to statistical laws. And that became really the dominant outlook, and the whole science of genetics became part of that, is to say, well, the genetics, the chromosomes, the genetic information is like a computer tape. People have heard these sort of analogies. It's a computer tape, it's an instruction manual that tells the cell how to produce, this protein, this amino acid, this hormone, and that in some way determines or dictates the function of every cell that makes up a human being or an organism. And that therefore the eugenics side of the story comes in and says, well, everything from mental retardation to alcoholism to poverty.
Yeah, pauperism.
Yeah, ultimately.
If you were a pauper, they could grab you and sterilize you.
Ultimately has a genetic basis, and that if we can weed out these weaker, sort of deviant forms, that we'll produce a better population. This is how we'll improve the human race.
That argument doesn't seem to work because they have this so-called junk DNA.
Well,
I mean, you don't get that if you know what you're doing.
the real proof of it is that we still produce idiots, who are the scientists. We still have Prince Philip, but we still have people advocating these ridiculous theories.
I'm the germ or virus that gets.
What?
Are there smaller organisms that can evade a germ or a virus and cause it to get sick, just
Well,
like germs?
Pasteur.
Or viruses evade us, or is this not known?
Well, I mean, there are things like bacteriophages, which are viruses that attack bacteria. And Pasteur, going back to the period when he was working on silkworms, when he recognized there were certain analogies that you could make between disease processes in silkworms and in humans, that he speculated on the possibility of being able to use this knowledge of how bacteria functioned to actually try to attack, other diseases.
This reminds me of one of the things that Pasteur did is he made proposals to the French government to create clean sanitary situations in the city, okay? Built sewers so that you didn't have, human waste all over the place. And he also talked about the construction of roads. He was involved in just whatever would benefit mankind, he was involved in it.
Related to.
Yeah, to help. He even ran for the Senate in France.
I'm like getting a direct parallel here to the flu shot.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
What kind of shot?
Flu shot.
Flu. Influenza.
During his time as a scientist and contributor, what do you know what scientists from the United States or elsewhere, because you're talking a lot about the attacks that he was under, and what correspondence or friends did he have?
That's a good question. It's a very good question. He became very famous after anthrax. They started, I went to the New York Public Library and I began looking at all of the books that give you the magazines that people, anyways, I inspected magazines going back to 1860. I couldn't find anything before the 1860s about Pasteur, nothing. But on anthrax, they start interviewing him, and then he becomes very, very famous when he does the rabies. And the only scientist that I've been able to find out anything about is Dr. Valentine Mott, M-O-T-T. And Mott was the son of a Civil War surgeon. And he went to Paris. He wrote to Louis Pasteur. He went to Paris. He was collecting rabbits that had the disease in them, bringing back to New York and producing a vaccine in New York City. He wanted to set up a Pasteur Institute in the United States. Now, as I said, the United States didn't have one. They tried to set up a Pasteur Institute in Chicago, in St. Louis, in Baltimore, in Boston, in New York City, Los Angeles. There are about 14 places that they attempt to set up a Pasteur Institute, and nothing is done. They all get squashed. You have in New York what's called the Pasteur Foundation, which is different. The foundation is basically a money-making operation, raising money for the Pasteur Institute in France. And I called the person in charge of the Pasteur Foundation, and I said, why isn't there a Pasteur Institute? And she said to me, well, the Rockefellers, you know, they built the Rockefeller University, and this is what we have in the United States. Like, this was a good thing, right? And she more or less said, you didn't need a Pasteur Institute because rabies had been conquered. So there was no point in having an institute in the United States.
What's Rockefeller University? How is that related to a potential?
Nothing. The Rockefeller University is in New York City, is primarily interested in this molecular biology, genetics,
Yeah,
DNA.
well, that would be related, right? I mean, you know. In other words, you mentioned, you said that they said, well, you have the Rockefeller University, like that was a consideration of not having a Louis Pasteur
Right.
Institute. So I wanted to see the relevance of how would you juxtapose one versus the other. Like, why would you have a Rockefeller and not have a Louis Pasteur University?
Because the money wasn't put forward to finance it.
Oh, okay, so it was a money question.
Yes. Yeah, that's what we did, is after all this was done, we started following the money trail. Because in France, I mean, you know, and all throughout Europe and other developing
They
countries,
recognize him as a country man, so.
yeah, they recognized him as a, you know, a man benefiting mankind. And there were institutes set up. And in the United States, there's none. You have the beginning of them, and then nothing happens. So when we started looking, we saw, oh wow, gee, look at this. We have eugenics. Look, the Rockefellers gave $10 million over a period of years for this. I said that's a whole other class, but I mean, this is what you've got. That's what we have here. It's a problem now.
Well, they finally accepted pasteurization.
Yeah, but that's the only thing people know about Pasteur. If you think about it, if you were to query the guy on the street, what do you know about Louis Pasteur? Most of them are going to say, well, isn't he the guy who pasteurized milk? He
If
did.
pasteurized meant they heated to.
Yeah, right. He did do that, but that's all people know is his name and pasteurization. They don't know all the other things that Roger and I talked about today.
Well, they're in the same vein, you know, killing microscopic or.
Nobody knows about anthrax, silkworms,
They're all
spontaneous.
bacteria. They're all like microbes and stuff like that that influence the body through things we can come into contact with.
Right.
So, I mean, to just say pasteurized, yeah, he dealt with germs and how to not get infected by germs. But that's not.
No, my point is that all they know about is the milk experiments. People don't know that Louis Pasteur stopped rabies. They don't know.
But he didn't stop the bubonic plague, though.
Actually, he did. He studied that. He didn't stop the plague, but he did go to, there were some people who were carrying the plague, and they were coming in Marseille, and he went down there. Also, people coming in for yellow fever. And he went there because he wanted to, you know, to study it, but they were all dead. Couldn't do anything about it.
I'll tell you something.
I've heard that there's a problem now with pasteurized milk in the sense that it's illegal to sell unpasteurized milk in some states, and people have been arrested for it. Some people think that pasteurized milk actually kills good bacteria in milk. Understand what the fight is between pasteurized milk and raw milk?
Well, this is, you know, a kickback, you know, to the Dark Ages. People died from unpasteurized milk. 100,000 children every year at summertime in Europe and the United States would die from milk fever.
Wouldn't that be due like if the conditions were unsanitary, like farm conditions?
Yeah, but that's, when you heat it, you kill the bacteria from
But,
that,
I
right?
mean, in line with what she's saying, like, in other words, they bring back this organic, green, like, keep everything above board. Don't feed them like dead animal parts. Don't feed them the cows or the sheep, whatever, dead animal parts.
Right.
This whole contaminated way of livestock breeding or milking, whatever. And then if you take it back to simplicity, you keep it above board, wouldn't the milk just be pure and healthy without being pasteurized?
No. I mean, we're surrounded, our bodies, are surrounded and covered in bacteria and viruses. And so it's a very dangerous world out there. And, there's something you got to be really conscious of, that particularly since the 60s and the development of this whole environmentalist movement, there's been the promotion of this idea of some idyllic, natural, untouched nature there are butterflies fluttering around and birds chirping and everybody is happy and we all live, happily ever after. And most of the arguments, and I'm not specifically addressing raw milk or anything like that. It's dangerous. It's dangerous. And yeah, it is possible that there are some bacteria that are going to be killed in the process of pasteurization that may have some useful purpose. Our gut is full of bacteria. They are absolutely essential to digestion. So it's true that there are beneficial bacteria. But this whole movement toward natural farming and, we don't want any pesticides and we don't want any of these things, you can best understand sort of the place of that if you watch some of these videos of Prince Philip and David Attenborough and the people who are advocating the elimination of 6 billion people. They're the biggest financiers of all of that, of environmentalism, of a return to natural farming, which cannot support the current.
Yeah, but
wait, hang on. We got to let everybody talk. Is that you cannot support 7 billion people, let alone 10 or 15, based on those kind of agricultural techniques. And what they are basically arguing is that mankind is like a deer or a sheep or any other animal which has a fixed population boundary based on the carrying capacity of the earth, right? Everybody's heard that term. There's a carrying capacity. There's only so much water. There's only so much land. We can only produce so much corn. X amount of pollution is going to destroy our water and our air. No, nobody's saying that. But the point is that this is something which is subject to willful, deliberate action by man. We can figure those things out. See, this is where it becomes, just a broad spectrum sort of anti-technology, assault, is where you pick up on something like nuclear weapons. Well, because nuclear weapons are bad, therefore nuclear power must be bad. Or because, you can have deleterious effects from pesticides, therefore we shouldn't do anything about pests, whether they be insects or diseases that destroy crops. Whereas that's the whole point of science. That's the whole point of Pasteur's work. It's not that he knew everything, but he's saying if we commit ourselves to understanding these processes, if we commit ourselves to improving the life of mankind, and that obviously doesn't simply mean making profits for some, livestock company, but if our goal, and this is where it's a question of whether we have elected a government which has those goals, right, is if we are committed to the improvement of mankind and the environment that we live in, then we can solve these problems in a way that does improve the standard of living of people around the world. You look at the...
Vaccines for a minute. Why can't flu vaccines be produced in a more efficient way than using shaken eggs for vaccines?
Well, one of the...
They could
Yeah.
in a chicken egg?
Because it's a very difficult problem to grow an influenza virus in a petri dish, much like rabies. You can't grow it in a petri dish. So actually the most efficient way to mass produce influenza vaccines is still using eggs. The real problem is that the influenza virus mutates so rapidly that every year you have to figure out what's the most likely strain of influenza that we're going to be hit with. And then,
How are they doing more research on how to make it better and faster?
hey, look, this is,
Insane.
this is exactly what we're talking about, is that there are critical shortages of medicines in this country as well as the rest of the world because it's not profitable to produce some of the cheap generics, so the pharmaceutical companies stop making them.
You know what's
Right.
advertised for medicine?
Viagra.
Viagra,
So
depression.
yeah, and you overlay on that an economic and financial collapse that's destroying the infrastructure, the ability to produce much of anything. And then you have this financial oligarchy running wild, simply saying, where can we loot? What can we loot to keep this system going for another week or month?
So it's not profitable to produce a flu vaccine unless they want to kill people.
Yeah, basically, in short.
Go ahead.
Yeah,
Do you think
Mark.
it's possible to analyze the breed, hate, racism, things of that nature, the same analogs or even a similar system in what Pasteur studying these bacteria and their destruction? If we can find a vaccine that gets rid of
Stupidity.
Yes, it's called LaRouche PAC.
Right.
It's on the market. It's readily available. We're mass producing it as quickly as we can. Marcel, you had a question.
It was just a comment about all this. It goes back to, I'm teaching in a couple of my classes, often Sinclair's The Jungle now.
Oh yeah.
Well, maybe his politics left something to be desired. When he talks about going on in slaughterhouses and so forth in the turn of the century, that same turn of the century, when the
Right.
Rockefellers and so forth were operating, and these people had truly animal-like conditions. I'm pulling, you pull a lot of modern things, government white papers, things like that over the last 20 years, in meat processing plants, in milk producing plants, in medical plants, in all these things. Because, all these people who talk about, oh, the government, big government is bad, this and that. Well, because they pulled back the inspectors, because they've gone back to, just whatever's profitable. The conditions are as appalling. They've become as appalling over the last 10, 15, 20 years in the plants that produce most of our food. So really, in terms of, because of the actions of the oligarchy, the only thing that's standing between us right now, this minute, and massive plagues again, maybe the pasteurization, the pesticides, the things like that that are being used, because heaven knows our country and the Western world doesn't do anything else anymore to actually take into account the general welfare of the people.
Right.
So this whole thing, I'm just addressing the whole thing with raw milk or DDT or this and that, those are all operations, and it's clear they are, to kill people.
Right.
Yeah. And
They nearly wiped out malaria back in the 60s until Rachel Carson and her gang. Yeah, and now it's as common as, more common, it's more dangerous, it's worse than it's ever been. Marion? One more question? Okay.
Pasteurization kills bacteria in the milk. But like the farmers, like in Vermont, they keep their milk for the pickup truck. Comes on after the system. They take samples from each farmer, label it on the little tubes that they put in. And if they find that it's too high a bacteria
the environment has to be clean.
Yeah, they handle all the equipment.
Exactly, yeah.
So are you saying that the pasteurization doesn't kill some of the bacteria? Well, I don't understand what.
Yeah, I mean, see, because there is a certain balancing act going on. You're not subjecting the milk, you're not boiling it for 5 hours, which would totally sterilize it, but probably make it useless, as food. So that they heat it to a point that kills most of the bacteria, so it has a shelf life, right? It doesn't mean that you can put it in the basement unrefrigerated for 6 months and take it out. Bacteria will grow in that period of time. But it extends the shelf life sufficiently while maintaining the nutritional value of the food. That's really the idea is to make it safe.
Available to the masses.
Yeah, so that
not living on a farm.
you have time to ship it, to store it for a certain period of time and consume it safely, which may be a month or two. It's not totally sterile, but that's sufficient to still provide the nutritional value that you want in the first place. Do we have to move
Yeah.
on?